the response to Douglas Murray on Joe Rogan.
There's been a tilt in the conversation, both conversations, and it's largely to do with people who have appointed themselves experts who are not experts.
It's kind of cheap to say things, but it's expensive to rebut things.
He's telling stories about what happened during the Second World War. But then he says, well, I'm not an historian. How do we regulate podcasts in a way that they can't sort of spin off to like very
Do you really think that? A topic that has been kind of playing out behind the scenes, which is the response to Douglas Murray on Joe Rogan. And we're not going to comment necessarily on any of the specific points of that discussion, but more about the discussion itself and the effect that that's had on the discourse, particularly on its relation to expertise and the responsibility that people have when they go on big podcasts and talk about, things that maybe the people they're speaking with aren't equipped to rebut. I guess I'll start off with just saying, I don't think it's that ridiculous of a thing to say having been somewhere makes you better equipped to talk about it. Anyone who's spent any kind of amount of time in their life traveling has all come to the same conclusion that there's just no ways you could necessarily know about a place without actually seeing the mechanics of day-to-day life there. And not only that, like traveling broadly makes you realize that you can't really generalize about a people very much because you'll just meet so many different characters within any given context. And so, that's the first point. And that was a weird thing that was being pushed back against it. I think, going somewhere gives you a kind of a perspective that you just have to be there to get. The second point is around the relative cost of saying things that are how do you frame this diplomatically? It's kind of cheap to say things, but it's expensive to rebut things, And if you're going on a podcast and you're not claiming to be any kind of expert, which is a great out, but you're talking about things with the level of kind of candor and in a way like vitriol, maybe vitriol's the wrong word, it's too charged, but you're just interested in it, but you're speaking about it like you know everything about the topic. You kind of can't have it both ways in some sense. And, it gets on to kind of Darryl Cooper, who inadvertently or not, kind of ends up literally like regurgitating stuff that was like straight up Nazi propaganda that's been rebutted in the past. And you need a very like skilled person in a way to talk about these things and to tiptoe around in a way the edges and kind of feel out the contours in a productive way, that if you're not equipped with the full like armory of knowledge that it would take to rebut all those individual points, which very few people realistically are, and the people who are, we would probably call experts of some degree, it leads you to basically be overall like a net negative on the progress of the discourse, if you see what I mean. And I love this point that Eric Weinstein makes, which is about it's not enough just to have like the legal right to free speech, but you also have to have a really strong culture around free speech to use it judiciously, because it can't be true that it's fine just to say anything you want at any point in time, all the time. Like, you should have the freedom to do that, but you should have the wisdom to use the speech judiciously and not in such a way that kind of just leads to, you need the speech so you don't get totalitarianism, but you need to use it judiciously so you don't just get like pure unbridled like civic chaos. And it's really a question of like, is sunlight always the best disinfectant? I'll just leave that there as a kind of as a thought.
Yeah, that's what my take on the whole sort of topic around non-experts talking about facts or history or basically things that can be either verifiable or as true or not, but basically the non-experts having their own, being able to opine on certain things, and then using the fallback as I'm not an expert to basically be used as a get out of jail free card. And I love that phrase. I don't know if you coined it or if you got it from somewhere when you said it's very cheap to say things but very expensive to sort of take things back. I think that's so true, and it should be true. But what we're finding here is that these sort of pseudo historians like Darryl Cooper and like Dave Smith, who talks obviously a lot about what's going on in the Middle East, how they will basically use the phrase, well, I'm not an expert, I'm not claiming to be an expert on this. They found a very cheap way of basically taking back anything that they've said, but they haven't taken it back. What they're doing is basically repackaging what they're saying and sort of saying, look, I'm not actually trying to say facts here. What I'm trying to say is something completely different. I'm trying to tell a story. I'm trying to communicate something. But the thing that interests me the most is the fact that they think that by claiming not to be an expert or claiming not to be like an historian or a journalist or any of these sort of traditional categories that we would typically associate with people that are saying the same sort of things that they're saying, that I actually have greater issue with this, because let's just take an historian as an example. If you're listening to an historian like Andrew Roberts, who's like the most celebrated biographer of Winston Churchill, he is an expert on Winston Churchill and he knows everything that's happened in his life. And when you hear him talk about Winston Churchill, because you know that he's an historian, you basically remove any sort of preconceptions that he would have some sort of bias towards it. I mean, obviously, there's going to be some bias that you might sense from, the certain stories that he's choosing or not. But there's also a general sense that he's basically he's aiming to be as objective and as truthful as he can be, because he's operating within, and I really want to draw as well, like to what we were talking about earlier about systems and things. He's operating within a system that is the category of like historian, and basically what historians do is they assess the evidence and they listen to different takes or accounts of what's happened in the past, and then they make a conclusion of like, well, what were these people trying to do or aim for? What was the overall objective of these people? And it's all within a very much a framework that we all recognize and that we're all able to sort of understand. And so, what a historian is, what they do, because that's a typical role that has existed basically forever, and since like Thucydides basically, and and so we're able to understand Andrew Roberts, and we're able to understand what he's saying about Winston Churchill within this whole wider context that I've just tried to describe. Now you've got someone like Darryl Cooper basically who's saying same things about history. He's telling stories about what happened during the Second World War, but then he says, well, I'm not an historian. Then you're like, well, whoa, I actually don't have a wider framework then. I don't have a wider reference framework to actually place the sort of like the detailed things that you're saying in, because if you're not in this category of historian that sort of looks at things from and tries to be objective with what they're saying and tries to be impartial or tries to give an honest account of certain views and things like that, which we would typically assume an historian was doing, and you're saying that you're not that, then what are you then? And I think,
Yeah.
and the thing that troubles me the most is that, well, actually, there must be an ulterior motive then for why you're saying these things. Because let's look at someone like, the History Channel Oversimplified, which
Yeah.
they, like, huge channel, like, very annoyingly, they don't release a video very often. It's maybe like once a year they'll do like a video or something, but very like well-known YouTube channel that basically tries to oversimplify, that tries to tell history, but in a very oversimplified manner. So very cartoonish, very easy to understand and easy to follow. Now they're going to give an account of history that's very, very different than the account that someone like Andrew Roberts might give, but they claim to be a history channel. Like, that's what they are. They're a history channel, and because they're using this word history, and because they're saying that they're a history channel, you're able to easily understand basically the information that they're giving you, even though it's of the different sort of like it's told differently. The stories that they're saying is very oversimplified, and it's very sort of like cartoonish, and maybe it skips over a lot of details. Again, it's operating within this wider framework of history, so that you're able to easily interpret what it is that they're saying. And so the issue that I have with these people like Dave Smith and like Darryl Cooper is that they're operating outside of this whole framework, this traditional framework, as what we know as history. So if what they're talking about isn't history, then how is it that we should engage with their content if it's not history? They claim to be a storyteller. Darryl Cooper tells that he's telling stories. Well, then then how should I understand?
Is it entertainment?
Is it entertainment or is it not? It's not. I don't think it's purely entertainment, because I've listened to Darryl Cooper, and he tries to tell things about what's happened in a non necessarily entertaining way. He's saying them as if, like, look, this is something that you need to understand, or that you should learn about these guys, is that, like, they're not all as good as they may seem, and that there is some skeletons in their closets. And then when you're sort of bought into that narrative of like, he's wanting to give a counter view of something, and he's wanting to give the contrarian version of like what is typically understood in pop culture, then you sort of do look at it with, well, is this alternate history? Is this history that has been put in the shadows and been shielded from us, like everyday humans? But and if it was that, then it would be, you'd have an easy sort of like way of categorizing what it is that he's saying. But because he's claiming not to be an historian and claiming not to be under this framework of history, I find it very, very like challenging to basically understand what his motive is then, if it's not to give an accurate view of like what's happened in the past. Maybe I'm taking what he's saying about not being a historian too literally, but I think I have to give him the credit of not. I think I have to like basically use his own words, because he would easily dismiss any comments that he was a historian and that he should be basically held to the same standard as a historian. And I think he's doing two things. One, he's trying to basically move the goalposts. He's trying not to be placed in that category as history, so that he's not held to that standard of being very judicious with the stories and with the accounts that he's telling. But I think deeper and darker is that there's an ulterior motive that he has as to like, why is he trying to take the contrarian stance against like our heroes in the West? And I think that there is a bit of, and this is not me being objective, this is me perhaps sort of projecting or like sort of adding an extra layer on what I see on him. But I do see someone that is very much like angry at our Western heroes that we typically see, like Winston Churchill, and he's upset that people hold them to such high standards and such high, like, they admire them a lot. And I don't know, I see a little bit of darkness in what he's doing.
I guess just to put your point back to you, basically what you're saying is, if he's not a historian, what is he actually trying to do with respect to communicating history? Is he trying to come to basically the most well-rounded, well-researched point of what actually happened based on the most amount of evidence? And then by presenting himself as an expert, i.e. going on a podcast and talking about history, but withdrawing the claim that he has any responsibility to like kind of be held to the standard of I'm trying to seek maximum truth in what I'm doing. Essentially, in a way, just to upgrade your point a little bit here, what he's doing is he's putting the onus on everyone else to fact check and basically verify his claims, as opposed to internalizing that responsibility to say, it is my job to come to like the most accurate point of truth. But the simple fact is most people just don't have the bandwidth to verify everything they hear on every podcast they listen to. And so you're in this like weird point where like they're trying to abdicate the responsibility of, you know, in a way, I guess the most generalizable way you could say this is they're trying to abdicate the responsibility of precise speech, true speech, speech that's worthy of the culture of free speech. And they're saying it's your responsibility. You know, this is in a way just like entertainment. And I think the first people to really do this were the comedians, right? Where if you listen to like, you know, and in a way, like it's true, right? Like if Joe Rogan does something, he's like, I'm just a comedian, I'm just joking around. But I wonder, like, you know, what's the logical extreme, like the South Park version of this, where, you know, you've got like a guy like who's like LARPing as a general in the army, and he's like sending people to their death, and he's like, I'm not a soldier, you know, like, or a surgeon who's about to cut someone's brain open and like slice his lips. He's like, I'm not a, you know what I mean? Like,
oh, actually, that's an interesting question, because what would you say? How would you describe someone who has learned how to do lobotomies from YouTube and has mastered the art to a degree that he is basically just as skilled as a surgeon that has gone to medical school for, you know, the full term, and he's worked, you know, in a hospital, and he's gone through the proper protocol and proper standards and everything, and but then you've got this other guy who's just learned every single thing from YouTube. He's never stepped a foot inside a university. He never stood inside a hospital, never done actual, you know, research on the thing or whatsoever. But let's just say you put him, like you put a body in front of him, and he's able to perfectly do lobotomies, and he can repeat it as well. He can do it. He can do brain surgery, you know, without error every single time he's given a case. Would you call him a surgeon?
I don't think that's what Darryl Cooper's doing.
I think I think it's very, very similar to like how people view Darryl Cooper, because I think what Darryl Cooper's saying is that he's not an historian, which basically he's saying, you shouldn't put me in that category because I approach what I read with a very, very different set of principles, basically. And I think that Darryl Cooper's fans, or like people that support him, would basically say that he's this sort of equivalent of, I don't know what you call it, but the surgeon versus the sort of non-surgeon surgeon type thing. Like, I genuinely believe that that's how people view him. They view him as a self-taught historian, and by him saying that he's not an historian, he's basically not saying that he's not telling history. He's not saying that. What he's saying is that I've not gone to university to study history. I'm not a professor in history. I'm not. So you should not hold me to these same standards, or you shouldn't expect me to be like an Andrew Roberts or like Tom Holland or anything. You shouldn't hold me to that standard. Like, don't sort of like critique me in the same ways as you do these other people, because I'm different. I'm self-taught. And his fans are like, well, yeah, you are. Like, you're different. Like you come at it from a different angle. And I think that's what the difference is here.
It's interesting because in my mind, I'm like comparing Darryl Cooper to another person who communicates history while proactively claiming that they're not a historian, which is Dan Carlin. I don't know if you know or listen much to Dan Carlin, but I've listened a lot to Dan Carlin. So some of his series multiple times. Arguably, a lot of what I know about the Roman Empire, about kind of Caesar and that whole kind of period of history, the kind of collapse of the Roman Empire, is from Dan Carlin's podcast. Same with the Mongolians. Fantastic podcasts. His method is basically to read like 7-8 books on a topic, and then communicate the facts such as they are in the most entertaining way possible. I would argue Dan Carlin's quite an orator, and listening to his podcast is almost like a return to the oral tradition. You know, sitting around a campfire for about millennia, human beings would hear the stories of their ancestors over and over again. You listen to the podcast over and over again. And I mean, the difference is no like kind of variation because it's a recording, but it's kind of like a return to that type of history. I think the difference in what the claim "I'm not a historian" is doing with Dan Carlin versus Darryl Cooper is Dan Carlin is saying, take everything I say with a pinch of salt. This may change. I'm not the best person to necessarily assess in good faith any of the claims that I'm making. I'm just a massive fan of history, and it's my job to communicate this in the most entertaining way possible. What Darryl Cooper's doing, in a way, because you can't say he's doing it for entertainment value only, is what he's saying is, I don't want to take any responsibility for the claims that I'm making necessarily. Does that kind of like resonate with you?
Sounds like what Dan Carlin is doing is that he's making it no secret about what's going on in his brain and like what his objective is and what he's aiming to do with what he's saying, and he's also making it. He's sort of like overqualifying what he's saying with like, oh, by the way, like, please do your own research, and like these are the texts that I've read. Obviously, like those texts themselves might have some inherent bias in them as well, and so on. So he's very much trying to give as much context and as much information to his listener or to his watcher to allow them to make a decision for himself. Where maybe the difference between that and Darryl Cooper is he's made the decision for you of like what the intentions were of whoever he's speaking about, and he's basically packaging it up and basically giving you a sort of package and not really allowing you to sort of work out for yourself what to do with the information he's giving you. He's basically giving you sort of pre-packaged ideas.
This kind of leads me on to the next question. How do you feel about the claim that if you have a platform, you therefore have responsibility due to the reach of that platform?
Yeah, I think that with power with power comes influence, and with the ability to influence comes responsibility. I think that you can't have an immense power or an immense capability of being able to influence minds without having some degree of responsibility for how you're being able to influence minds. And I think that that's basically what we're seeing now with these podcasts, is that they've grown so big, that they've amassed so much power, that I think it's about time that we start talking about it, in governments, about like actually how do we regulate podcasts in a way that they can't sort of spin off to like very
Do you really think that? Because that is the core of this free speech argument, right? This is what I was saying at the beginning. You can't like regulate speech in that way without treading down the garden path to basically totalitarianism, right? Who's the central commissar regulating what podcasts are allowed to go out? What you need is like a strong sense of like civic duty. It's the only way you can regulate speech is the culture around it. You cannot make it a top-down regulation. It has to be a bottom-up spirit of what is a responsible way to use this right that has been very expensive for my ancestors to acquire for me.
Yeah.
And just to exonerate Churchill somewhat here, there's a quote he gave. I've been listening to the Andrew Roberts audiobook recently, and I have to throw in some Churchill here because the person we're talking about. But he was giving a speech to Harvard University in 1944, and it was addressing some of the isolationists in the US, and basically the people who were reticent for the US to step into the shoes of global hegemon. And what he said is, one thing he said is, you cannot become the ruler of the world without taking interest in what happens in all the various parts of it, because by definition, it will have to affect you. And the second point that he said, which I think is very relevant for our discussion here, is the price of greatness is responsibility, right?
Yeah.
And you cannot have one without the other.
Yeah. I think when I was talking about regulations when it comes to podcasts and like government regulations, I wasn't necessarily talking about speech. I was basically talking about the podcasts themselves. So an example of that would basically be, you can't, let's just say YouTube created categories of podcasts, and they had entertainment, and they had history, and they had, whatever. There'd have to be some sort of regulation that basically said you can't have a podcast that is clearly not history in the history podcast, in the history category, because that is misleading people. And it could actually have the potential to mislead hundreds of millions of people into believing that something that is just a fantasy or a fiction is actually non-fiction. And I think that the podcast industry is going to be so big that it's much larger than the legacy media has ever been, because obviously, like, we're growing as a population, but also we're, well, not necessarily as an entire population, but the amount of people that are adopting technology is growing, and obviously that means that I think, I don't know if you would agree with this, but I do believe that the potential for where podcasting can go as in terms of its influence on being able to share news updates will be bigger than what the legacy media has ever been able to achieve. I think that trend is going, and so I think that there's going to have to be, in the same way that news is regulated, I think that podcasting industry is going to have to be regulated. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm wanting to regulate what people can and can't say on podcasts. And I think that what a regulation is, and I just want to tie this back to actually what you said about project management, or about efficient bureaucracies, is basically that the reason why you need project management structure is because the best way for a project to work basically is, like, imagine you get like 3 of the most competent people in the workplace, and you basically say, hey, figure out this thing. I want you to roll out this project in like 3 months. And they basically were like, okay, what should we do? Well, we need to speak to these people. We need to make sure that they're bought in. We need to create an objective. We need to create deliverables. We need to do all this. And then we need to create a timeline. And then we need to make sure that we've got all these stakeholders bought in. And then we need to, like, create actionable steps and blah, blah, blah. Like, they're doing all this sort of intuitive things that in order to get this project sort of like delivered on time and executed efficiently. Now, what someone would do if they were in the back of that room with a notepad is write every single thing that they're doing, and they would basically create a project management framework. And they would say, okay, well, what they did was they did stakeholder identification. Okay, that's the first thing that they're doing. And then what they do, they're creating a project. Well, they did the objectives, and then they said what their goals are, and then they said what deliverables they want. Okay, let's create this thing called a project charter, where you write down what you want to achieve and all that. And they're basically, what they're doing retrospectively is creating a framework as to, like, what worked in that project and how they were able to deliver that efficiently. They're making that into a sort of formula, or like a sort of structure that is scalable and replicable, so that other people who aren't as competent as them to figure it out for themselves are able to follow the step-by-step playbook in order to carry out the project efficiently. That was basically what that was the sort of steel man for, like, a bureaucracy, essentially, and a very sort of like generalist, like, point of view of, like, why do you need structure in companies? Built for that reason, so that those who are less competent than the competent ones are able to work just as efficiently. And basically tying this to what we're talking about in the podcast world is, we need to basically figure out what the best podcasts and what the best platforms are doing at the moment, in order to make sure that they're not misleading their audience, and make sure that they're giving honest information, make sure that they've got the best of each side of a different argument on their podcast to share their different points of views. And then we're going to have to basically look at what are the most competent people doing in this industry, and we're going to have to, like, learn from them. And then we're going to have to create regulation or create structure around what they're doing, and then implement that into the industry, so that any two sort of people that are starting a podcast who aren't competent, that don't really know what to do with the responsibility or the influence of power that they're amassing by their sort of by how good their podcast is, and that they're able to operate within this framework, so that they don't have to think too much about, actually, how do I cope with all this power and all this influence that I've got, and this means I've got so much responsibility, that actually the framework's there to allow them to prosper without thinking too much. And I think that's what regulation does by its nature, is that it's what good regulation does by its nature, is that it should naturally fit into the way that people want things to be done, in a very natural way that sort of optimizes for growth, and that optimizes for prosperity, that optimizes for for those things. I don't know if you see my, like, the where I'm trying to get to, but I think there will be a point where there's going to be regulation there, but it's not going to be bad regulation. It's going to be regulation that is influenced, that's going to be derived from what the most competent people at the top of their game have shown works, and that is replicable and scalable, just the same way that the top performers in the company set the standard for how things are delivered and carried out. It's going to be the same in the podcast world, I believe, as well.
I think it's probably a good place to kind of leave the discussion. So look, this has been fun. Just jumping on one evening, just chatting about whatever's on our mind. From Prussian marching orders to podcast regulation. As always, pretty wide-ranging discussion. So cheers, man.
Never had a conversation with you.
Yeah, absolutely.